Have you ever wondered why it appears, at least, that some people find it easier to do what's right and other people struggle at it? Maybe a better way to personalize that question is, have you ever wondered why just yourself at times find it easier to be a Christian and to live according to all the principles that God would want you to live by, and yet at other times it seems like a struggle and almost impossible to be able to keep those commandments or to refrain from doing something that is wrong. I've thought about that. Why is that the case? And I think there may be a multiple answers to that and multiple factors that play into it, but I think maybe sometimes it is simply a matter of will. That if I find it at times easier to obey God, it may just be that those are things that I would have done anyway, are not tempted by anyway. And the other times when I find it difficult to be pleasing unto God, well, that's because I really want to do that, God, and you've said not to do it. We might illustrate it this way: if Deidre Dares leaves the house and leave me alone in there, and she says, "Now, I made a chocolate cake, but that's for company. Don't you dare touch that." Well, that's going to be I might as well just pack up and go with her, because that's going to be hard for me to resist. But let's just say another scenario: she leaves me at home and she says, "There's some cauliflower in the refrigerator, but that's for company. Don't eat it." Well, no problem there. If that was the last thing in the house, I would eat the furniture before I ate the cauliflower. And so I found it easy, and then I found it difficult. But the difference was it was something that I wanted to do and something that I wouldn't have done even if it wasn't forbidden. And I think that's a struggle that we face. And so then the question comes, well, then how can I apply the fortitude that I have not to do what I don't want to do to not doing something that I really want to do? How can I make that universal? How can I truly conform my will to God's will? And not only do that, but to do that with less of a struggle than I may be facing. And I think part of that process then comes in how we view the law of God. And I think spiritual maturity demands that we absorb into our mindset, our way of thinking, that this is God's law and that He knows better than I know. He even knows better than I know what's good for me. And so I'm going to conform myself to His will and to His law. And I know that's a struggle, and that's a part of growth as a Christian. But I want to talk to you this morning about the law of God. Would you start with me in the Old Testament, in the book of Deuteronomy? Deuteronomy chapter 10. You know the book of Deuteronomy is Moses' long farewell speech to the children of Israel. He's been with them from the very beginning. He's brought them all the way through the wilderness. The 40 years is just about up, and it's time to go into the promised land. But as you know from your study of Old Testament history, Moses isn't allowed to go with them. And so he's giving them this farewell speech, almost like a father to his children. Here's what you need to know. Here's what we learned or should have learned in that wilderness. Here's what we've learned or should have learned when God gave us that law at Mount Sinai. And here's what you need to do when I'm gone, when you go on ahead without me. Here's what you need to do and the way you need to view God and His law. And so notice this reading in Deuteronomy chapter 10. Let's begin in verse 12. He's going to be talking about really the essence of the law of God. And although we live under a different law, we have the new law versus the old law, the principle still applies. So let's look what Moses is saying to them and then I think to us under the law of Christ. Deuteronomy 10 verse 12 begins, "And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? but to fear the Lord your God, and to walk in all his ways, and to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments of the Lord and his statutes which I command you today for your good. Indeed, heaven and the highest heavens belong to the Lord your God, also the earth with all that is in it. The Lord delighted only in your fathers to love them, and he chose their descendants after them, you above all peoples, as it is this day. Therefore, circumcise the foreskin of your heart, and be stiff-necked no longer. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality nor takes bribe. He administers justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the stranger, giving him food and clothing. Therefore, love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall fear the Lord your God, and you shall serve him. And to him you shall hold fast and take oaths in his name. He is your praise, and he is your God, who has done for you these great and awesome things which your eyes have seen. Your fathers went down to Egypt with 70 persons, and now the Lord your God has made you as the stars of heaven in the multitude. If we could summarize what Moses is saying to these children of Israel about how they should view God and how they should view his law, it seems to me that he's saying you need to do what God says. And here's why. And I think he gives at least three reasons. You might find several more, but I find at least three reasons that Moses in this text says you need to do what God says. The first reason he says is that he's doing this for your good. Did you notice that language there in our text in verse 13? To keep the commandments of the Lord and his statutes, which I command you today for your good. Some translations say for your benefit, for your welfare. In other words, what he's saying here is that God is commanding you to do stuff that's good for you. Now, you could argue that it's good for you because if you don't, God's going to smite you down. But I think it's more than that. I think he's saying that the commandments and the statutes that God is ordering us in, it's number one, it's not a test. Let's see if they'll do this. No. And it's not of, let's see if I can make their life miserable. No, it's to make our lives better. And again, a state of spiritual maturity helps us to realize, my life is better when I do it God's way. And it is worse when I do it my own way. A silly illustration is your parents tell you not to go play in traffic. Well, why? They got something against traffic? They got something against you playing? No, that's for your benefit. That's for your welfare. They know you'll get killed if you go out there and play in traffic. So they made that command that is a restrictive command telling you what not to do, but they did that for you. They're trying to help you. And so that's argument number one. Let's keep the law of God because God is doing what's best for us. The second reason is, and maybe this should be the first reason in our hearts and minds, is because he's God. And he can tell you, he has that right. Just by nature of who he is and who you ain't, he can tell you what to do. And so you need to just get your mind right, and wrapped around that concept is that he is all powerful. And he has every right to tell me what to do, and therefore every right to judge me when I don't do it properly. But then the third argument, which is akin to the first one, is that not only is he all powerful, but he's all knowing. And he knows that if you do this, it's not going to end well. And he knows, you don't, but he does, that if you do this, it'll be better for you. And so he says, submit to the law of the Lord. And so let's talk about applying those principles in our lives and maybe practically what that's going to look like. We understand that what Moses was trying to get them to see and what trying to get us to see is that the loftiness of God and of God's law is why we obey him. And that law is greater than anything else that we could conceive of. But let's talk about three facets of our life where we need to make a real concrete application of this. First of all, we understand that God's law is superior to man's law. Turn with me in the New Testament to a familiar text on this subject, Romans chapter 13. Paul is making the argument that we need to submit to the governments of man. Why? Because they know better than we do? Well, sometimes they do, many times they don't. Is it simply because they're more powerful? They have the keys to the tanks and to the fighter jets, and so if we don't, we'll get punished? Well, that's certainly true, but that's not the reason that he gives. The reason he gives that we submit to them, he says, is because their power is derived not in and of themselves, but it's given to them by God. Look at it in Romans chapter 13, verse 1. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgments on themselves. Now, let's talk about this, what it's saying and what it means and what it doesn't mean. I don't think, and I'm pretty firm in this conviction, that when he says the authorities were appointed by God, I don't think that means that everybody who holds public office was handpicked by God. Whether it's President Trump or President Biden, I don't think he's saying God put those particular men in office. It seems to me what he's talking about is the principle of government. I think the same is true of the local churches. God appointed elders. Does that mean that God picked the men who might be elders in a particular congregation? Or does it mean that he said, here I want there to be elders in every congregation? And so I think the concept there of he appointed the idea of government, the idea that we needed somebody to tell us what to do and what not to do. God knew who we were and what we were and knew that we needed rules to abide by. And so it seems to me that he's not saying he appointed this person to be dog catcher, that man to be governor. He wanted this man to be president now, not then, but now. It seems to me that he's saying he's appointed the idea of government. And therefore, we are to be subject to that government because that has been given to us by God. Now, the next thing we need to see that what's not saying here, he's saying that they are carrying out really the mandate of God that there be government. That does not mean, and I think we can easily see that government's always doing the will of God. No. Broadly, they are. They're in a position of authority telling us how to live our lives, what not to do, what to do to make society better. Broadly, I think even in the cruelest of regimes, that principle is at least broadly applied. And so he's saying that this government receives its power from God. And so, look with me in 1 Peter chapter 2. And so our obedience to civil authorities is obedience to God. 1 Peter chapter 2. And let's look at verse 13. Therefore, submit yourself to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme, or to governors, or to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of those who do good. And so you see how this crouches everything. Why do I have to do what the government says? The government's corrupt. They're overtaxing us. They're passing these laws. I'm doing that because of my allegiance not to this government or to any government, because of my allegiance to God. Now, because of that, we understand the principle that Peter and the apostles in Acts chapter 5 would employ, that we ought to obey God rather than men. If there's any conflict in that, then it's easy choice for us, because we're not obeying the king, we're not obeying the president because they're king or president. We're obeying them because they're put in that position broadly by God. They've been given that authority by God. And so God's law is not only greater than man's law, but it's the only reason there can be man's law, is because God has allowed us to do that. But it gets maybe more practical and more difficult when I realize that God's law is also to be supreme to my emotions. And let's be honest that this is why we largely do what we do, and why we largely have difficult in conforming ourselves to the will of God. Why did you do that? Is the question that parents often ask their children. And if children were honest, and I'm going to tell children who might be listening, this isn't the good answer. It's probably an accurate answer, but it's probably not a good answer to give your parents when they say, "Why did you do that?" The answer really is because I wanted to, isn't it? Again, maybe not the wisest answer in that moment to give to your parents, but it's really the truth, isn't it? Why did you do that? Because I wanted to do that. It made me feel good. I was driven by the emotions of the moment. Now, let's make this point. I think emotions belong in our service to God, but emotionalism doesn't. There's a difference between emotions and emotionalisms. Emotions are the result of something proper and even thought out. Emotionalism is kind of a fake emotion that we put into that. But we also need to understand that our emotions don't dictate what's, or should not dictate what's right and wrong. Even our emotions, look with me in the book of Luke, chapter 14. Look at an extreme example of this that should tell us that my feelings about something are not to be the good guide. In Luke chapter 14, we're always troubled by the strength of this language, aren't we? When Jesus said in Matthew chapter 14, let's start in verse 25. Luke 14, verse 25, now great multitudes went with him, and he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Like I said, we struggle with the strength of that language. You've got to hate your family members and hate your own life also. Now, we could try to explain away maybe the strength of that language, but it doesn't take away the strength of that language. But I think Jesus was trying to bluntly shock these people who maybe he saw were coming to him for less than sincere motives. Maybe they wanted to be fed again, or maybe they wanted a miracle for themselves or a family member, or just watch a miracle. And Jesus was saying, look, following me is not something that you do because of some immediate gratification that you might get out of it. You need to count the cost. And that's going to be his future statements in this dialogue that he's having with these potential followers. You need to recognize you're going to have to give up everything. That you're not going to be able to do something based upon how you feel about something, how you feel about the person who's involved in this, that it's a family member. Doesn't matter whether it's your father or your mother, your brother or your sister, or even your own spouse. When God says something, that's your marching orders. It doesn't matter who it might involve and your feelings toward that other person, and that your feelings, he says, don't factor into it. Then we ask the question, again, may be uncomfortable to ask, well, why not? Doesn't God care how I feel? Doesn't God care about my emotions and my feelings toward other people and my feelings about my own self and my own life? And the answer is, it's not a matter of God not caring about your feelings. It's back to what Moses told the children of Israel. God knows all. And he knows this, that your feelings aren't a safe guide. I think about the Apostle Paul, who, in his previous life had done some horrendous things, but yet he could say, I've walked in a good conscience before God my whole life. I don't think he just meant from the time I obeyed the gospel and started trying to live right. I think he meant even when I was doing wrong, I thought I was doing right. You remember the words of God to the prophet Jeremiah? It's not in man who walketh to direct his own steps. Our feelings just really aren't a safe guide. And you can think about it in your own life. There were times when you acted just upon raw emotion and feeling, I just feel like this is the right thing to do. And guess what? You were right. But if you're honest, you can also think of times when you just thought, this just feels right. This is the right thing to do. And you did it. And it was the exact opposite of the right thing to do. And what that teaches us is that our emotions are not a reliable standard. And so we need something more reliable, something more knowledgeable. And we have God who knows all. And not only knows better than us, he cares for us better than us. We're again that child who may think it's going to be fun to go play in the traffic. But hopefully he's got a loving parent that realizes, no, that's not a good decision. And I know better than you. And so I'm going to exert that will and that authority over you. And so God's law is more important and to be elevated above man's law, above our emotions, and above our own will. The hardest thing to surrender to God is our will, is that desire to do what we want to do. But we need to recognize that sin, look with me in Romans chapter 1, that sin at its very nature is rebellion against the will of God. Notice what Paul says, and again, he uses what we might call an extreme example of this. But notice what he says in Romans chapter 1. Let's start reading in verse 20. He speaks of those who were incurring the wrath of God. For since the creation of the world, that is God's invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Let's go back to our scenario earlier. In talking about these people that Paul illustrates here, why did they do the things that they did? Because they wanted to. It's not because they didn't know God or have an opportunity to know God and to submit to his will for their lives. They did that because that's what they wanted to do. And until we understand that concept, and until we can, I started to say, suppress our own will and give over to the will of God. And there's some truth in that statement, but maybe a better way of saying it is until we surrender our will to God and recognize. We do that in other facets of life, don't we? Largely, at least. You know, uh, I recently took a plane flight, long plane flight. We were going, we were about 40,000 feet above the earth, going at about 500 miles an hour at times. And there was not a moment in that flight where it occurred to me, I need to take over the wheel. Because I knew that wasn't why. I don't know how to fly a plane. And so that would have been idiotic for me to go, let me do this. We do that largely with our doctors, don't we? A doctor says you need an operation. and we will submit ourselves. You think about how much trust you put in that doctor, that you let them just put you absolutely asleep, that they could do anything. You're so knocked out of it, and you're saying, yes, take that knife and cut me open and take some stuff out and put some other stuff in. That's how much I trust you. And again, never once it occurs to you, hand me the scalpel. Because we know that that's not why. You know better than I do. You went to school for this. You've trained for this. You know, whether it's flying a plane or operating on some important organ in your body, you recognize I have to submit and surrender myself to you completely. You're completely in control, whether it's that surgeon or that pilot. And we recognize the wisdom in that. But until and unless we recognize the wisdom that I need to do that same thing to God about every facet of my life, that how foolish it was for me in those times in my life to say, God, let me do this. You've heard this before, and so it's a little passe, but you remember the old bumper stickers years ago, God is my co-pilot? Somebody came up with a saying that if God's your co-pilot, you're in the wrong seat. And there's some wisdom in both of those sayings. I recognize that. But God's not our co-pilot. You better be the pilot. Uh, we better surrender everything to his will because, if for no other reason, he's God. And he's going to exert his will over us, whether voluntarily or by taking control on the day of judgment. But also we must surrender our will to God and to the law of God. It's because he is all-knowing. And so faith is much more than saying, I believe that God exists. Faith also must encapsulate the idea that I trust him with everything, that I'm going to surrender my life and my will to him completely because he is God and because he knows better than I do and because he's doing this for my benefit and for my welfare. You know, so often we learn those lessons too late, don't we? Both of my parents are gone. And I hope that at some point in my adult life, I communicated to them that I was sorry for my rebellion and my rebelliousness against them, and that I finally learned way after the fact that they knew better than me and they were looking out for me, even when I said no and made it difficult for them. And it seems like that we often, or maybe always, learn that lesson too late, don't we? Let's not make that same mistake with our Heavenly Father. Let's not learn that he is in control when he exerts his absolute control on the day of judgment. Let's recognize that now, even in our immaturity, that I must surrender everything to him because he is my God and I am his child. Would you do that? Would you make that full surrender to him this morning, saying that whatever you tell me to do, I will do? Every thought, every word, and every action will be governed by you. I surrender my will, my emotions, my everything to you. If we can help you in that surrender, in that obedience, would you let it be known right now as together we stand and as we sing?